Hey guys, it's Ashley.
And it's Brayden.
And we're here with Utah Trikes, and we're here to talk trikes. So today, we're going to talk about suspension.
Let's do suspension.
Yeah, and I'm kind of excited about that. And the goal that I've had as I've been thinking about having this Trike Talk today is, do you need a trike with suspension? You're out there, you're riding trikes, and you're already more comfortable than you would be on a two-wheel bike.
I mean, that's a fair question, right? You got a more recumbent, comfortable, in some cases padded seat, and a third wheel that kind of absorbs more impact than a two-wheel bike would.
Right.
So you're just generally more comfortable already. Do you need suspension all the time? Well, on pavement, probably not.
Well, how many, and I'm not looking for a number here, but how many of our trikes that we carry, the different manufacturers we work with make, even have suspension?
Like, it's even an option on them, right?
Yeah, most of them don't.
Maybe a quarter.
Yeah, maybe. There's really only one brand I can think of, and that's Ice, that makes a modular trike where you could, buy a trike and you can add suspension or not have suspension, have front suspension, rear suspension. It's all different. You could combine it. Most of your trikes that are out there, though, when you're making that decision, do I want to have suspension or not, you've got to make that decision right from the get-go.
Right. The suspension's proprietary.
Right.
Whereas on ice, you can kind of get a little loose with it.
Well, it's part of the frame.
Yeah.
It's a Catrike, for example. I mean, if I want a Catrike and I want suspension, I'm getting the Dumont or the All-Road.
Or the new suspension. Yeah,
right.
they only have the two suspension models. Right. And that's the same kind of with all of the other brands, right? You want a suspension Azub, you do the TieFly model. That's it. Or you do the Tricon, you get the one with the rear suspension, but there's no other way to add suspension to their other models. And I mean, that's across the board.
Right.
HP does the same thing. Sunseeker does the same thing. Stein does the same thing, right? You're going to pick the suspension models.
Well, and that's, really what made me want to have this conversation here is that you and I have been out riding a lot of suspension trikes.
Oh, yeah.
And when people think of suspension, a lot of times they're thinking, off-road, I'm jumping it, because they're thinking mountain bike. I've got a mountain bike, I've got suspension, the type of riding I'm doing. Whereas like in the two-wheel bicycle world, if it's a road bike, a street bike, usually that's not going to have any suspension because it's going to be as light as possible with no suspension. And an off-road mountain bike or downhill bike would have suspension. And you might have some that have, 5 or 6 inches of travel on the back, so you could actually jump this thing. Most people aren't out there jumping trikes. You can, though, if you want, right?
Well, I mean, you can do it on any of them if you really want to. I wouldn't recommend it.
You can jump any trike at least once.
Yeah.
Right. But as we have seen, there's different kinds of suspension for different kinds of riding. And I guess the first thing to consider is, do you need a suspension depending on the kind of riding that you're doing? And if you're riding on the road, the nice thing about suspension is that, yes, it will handle the occasional potholes and curbs, but what most of the manufacturers have leaned into for road riding is eliminating that vibration.
Right. I mean, we've already talked about it, more comfortable than a two-wheel bike, but it just elevates it that next step further with your suspension on road, right? Your on-road suspension model trike.
Sure.
And that's not to say, back to the terrain conversation, if you are going to be taking your recumbent trike off-road, you plan on doing off-road trails, there are better trikes suited with more suspension geared towards off-road riding that you should consider over just suspension trikes in general.
Well, and then there's off-road trikes that rely almost entirely on the bigness and the fatness of the tires.
Right.
Probably one of the most popular off-road trikes is the Ice Full Fat.
Yeah.
With 3 26 by 4 inch big fat tires, they hold a lot of air. We've ridden that off-road, really soft, really comfortable to ride. you're probably not going to be jumping that trike.
No.
But it will take you. It'll take you off road and take you where you want to go.
And that's really, I mean, reliant into that big fat tires. And there's a bunch of trikes that fall into this fat tire off-road category. It does have suspension, right? It has a rear elastomer based suspension in the rear, which is nice. I mean, it does make for a smoother, comfortable ride. It's the same suspension though that they use on their street road suspension models. So that off-road aspect really comes down to that 26 by 4 inch fat tire,
right?
And not the suspension made for off-road,
right? Well, and you mentioned it. Let's just dig right into, specific suspension types. So, we've already mentioned ICE a few times here. ICE is very unique in that they're using an elastomer-based rear suspension.
Yep.
But in a lot of ways, it's still common with the other trikes that we carry that have suspension, in that every manufacturer that is incorporating rear suspension into their trike that I can think of is utilizing a single pivot rear swing arm.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on the trike and the model, there are sometimes elaborate ways that a shock is connected up to that swing arm. But at the end of the day, there's one swing arm and it's pivoting on one pivot.
They're all doing it the same fundamentally.
Right. Yeah, so ICE is using elastomers. Mm-hmm. And the nice thing about elastomers is that they're inexpensive, mm-hmm. and they're really easy to swap out and change and manipulate in different ways. So for example, they're using, the very early ICE trikes, the Trice models, they use one elastomer and you get like a red one or a green one or a blue one. And now they have, different weights, light, medium, hard. And then you can even combine those where you might have, your lower one might be a soft one. It's a lightweight one. And then if you've got cargo, you might have a heavier weight on top of that.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you mentioned the elastomers being easy to kind of switch out and change. And that is true, right? You go back home, you tear it apart, you prop it open, pull out the elastomers, drop the elastomers in. They're pretty inexpensive, so trying things out, isn't too bad. The benefits that you have of doing a coil or air shock, though, you can do it on the fly.
Sometimes, and that's one thing that, as we've been out there and we've been testing out different trikes, the coil over shocks, which are prevalent, mm-hmm. Especially as a base option.
Right.
Even your high end, your HP Velotechnic and your Azubs, they're still coming stock. The stock option is still with that D&M coil over shock, mm-hmm. which is the same shock essentially that Sunseeker is using on the cheapest full suspension trike. And the nice thing about those shocks is that you can adjust the preload on those. For a heavier rider or a heavier load, you can tighten that spring down a little bit. To actually dial that in for the weight of the rider, though, requires that you change the spring itself to match. Most people at that level, though, you would want to, use an air shock, because then you can dial that in with the air shock. And you can adjust that pressure, and then you can adjust the rebound characteristics depending on, where you're riding. Mm-hmm. What I found though, as we've been riding again here, is the rear shock on most of the trikes that have rear suspension tends to have a lot more travel than the front.
Oh yeah.
If the trike has front suspension. But on the surface, it seems like that rear suspension would be more important. As we've been riding more and more, though, with suspension trikes and off-road riding, the less concerned I have been about the rear suspension.
I think that's because a lot of brands are doing the same thing for the rear suspension, and it's good and the same.
It's the same, but what I'm getting at is more that the impact of the shock mm-hmm. of the rear wheel, being that the rear wheel is further back behind me, is less apparent than when I have a good front suspension.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think that's more, and especially doing some off-road riding, we've been doing the more rigid front suspensions on some real off-road or more painful than something with a lot of travel.
Right.
And I've never complained about the rear suspension on any of them.
Yeah, and I guess that's what I'm getting at is like I haven't found that there's been a considerable difference in the way that a trike feels with the rear suspension, mm-hmm. and it's more apparent with the front suspension. For example, just this last week, we went and we took two trikes out. Mm-hmm. The HP Velotechnic Scorpion FX, which just has rear suspension, and we rode that and compared that to the Scorpion FS, which has front and rear suspension. Both trikes were 20-inch wheels. They both have the same shock in the back.
Oh yeah.
That front suspension,
A night and day difference.
Night and day,
yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Beyond just even how soft and comfortable the ride was, but also that carried over into the handling of the trike.
I mean, the whole frame design, I mean, everything has to change with the way, trike recumbent companies are building their front suspension. And that's really where you're seeing most variety when it comes to suspension models. The rear's typically the same, single pivot. Your front, though, and how they do it and how they do the front suspension is so drastically different between all of the different manufacturers. And HP Scorpion does a complicated German engineering swing arm.
Yeah, it's got A-arms with the torsion bar and then struts on the head tubes and a combination of springs and elastomers. There's a lot of parts. I don't think that any suspension out there on a trike has more parts than what HP Velotechnik is using on the Scorpion FS.
You'd have to compare it to your car. That's the closest thing you could get on the front suspension.
Yeah, there's a lot of parts. And you mentioned the different manufacturers are the way they're designing their front suspensions. And it's interesting because most of the manufacturers that we deal with are using a spindle based. Mm-hmm. So the absolutely most simple front suspension is that found on the Sunseeker Fathead CXS.
Right.
And that spindle has a spring in it. There's no shock absorption. It's a spring. So yes, it is suspended. And as long as you weigh in between,
there's a sweet spot with
the minimum and maximum, which I think we found, the ideal weight is probably right around 200 pounds. And
250 is the cutoff. You start feeling that front suspension bottom out.
And 250, you're bottomed out, and the springs really aren't doing anything. And I think if you're, 125 pounds, you're not even budging it.
Yeah, it's not moving at all.
So, really in between that 150 and 200 pound is where you get your body weight kind of acts as, the counterweight to the springs there. And, we talked about how easy it is to adjust some of these rear suspensions. And that's one suspension that is very simple and effective for a certain rider, but it is completely non-adjustable.
Right.
There's no way they're really hard to take apart, and you could take it apart. And I suppose that if Sunseeker felt like it, they might be able to offer some different weights of springs. But we even looked at that at one point, and we had a spring manufacturer. They had actually made a bunch of different springs for us. Mm-hmm. And the effort involved with taking them apart and putting them back together for almost no benefit.
Well, I mean, it was like now if someone comes in, they're like well over that exceeded weight of 250 pounds, and we'll just switch them to a rigid spindle.
You pretty much have to, because at that point, once you're above 250 on a Sunseeker suspension, the suspension's not doing anything for you.
And front suspension as a whole, especially like a spindle system that you see on a lot of them, if that is bottomed out all the time, that affects more than just your suspension, but your whole handling is wrong, and sometimes your alignment can be different now because that suspension is just not doing what it's supposed to do.
Well, and that, you mentioned alignment, that's probably the key flaw in Sunseeker's particular design of their front suspension, is that being built into the head tube itself, the angle of your Ackerman will actually change as the suspension goes up and down.
And as the weight of the rider changes, or the suspension kind of settles in a little bit,
right.
I mean, you're constantly fixing it on your alignment on the front,
yeah.
Just because of that suspension.
Yeah, so that's the simplest.
Right.
And then we've got other brands that are also using a spindle-based front suspension. That would be Ice and Catrike.
Right.
And Ice, one really cool thing about their suspension spindle is that they're the only manufacturer I know of that has made their spindle so that it will fit on all of their trikes.
We've talked about it before, the most modular trike out there, right?
Right.
You can change a lot about them, your tire size is easy to switch, but suspension, being able to add it down the road later to almost all of their models, and they use the same suspension spindle.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, they really do. I mean, you could even on some of their models that aren't supposed to have suspension, if the ice full fat,
yeah, I was like, we're thinking
the
of the
ice
same
full
one.
fat no longer has it, but there's no reason why it doesn't fit.
Right.
Even the VTX, you got a race trike, you could put front suspension on a VTX if you want. Which they have some of their own combinations, the Sprint X Tour, but they've made it so that their suspension is modular, but also adjustable.
Yeah.
So ICE's front suspension is elastomer based, and they use a cylindrical.
Yeah, it's a little long.
Yeah.
It looks like a cheese stick.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it does. Right. Yeah. Kind of like a string cheese.
Yeah, that's the word I was looking for.
Yeah, you got the ice string cheese elastomer, and the cool thing about the ice front suspension is how much travel they get out of that. And
they squeezed everything they could out of those spindles.
Yeah, and they really have a lot of suspension travel for a spindle-based front suspension, which kind of brings me to the newest front suspension trike or full suspension trike.
One of the ones that kickstarted this whole suspension journey,
Yeah.
the Catrike all-road, right, using the same or similar elastomer post suspension.
Yeah, so they use a spindle-based front suspension, and it's the exact same spindle-based front suspension that is found on the Dumont.
Yeah.
And it uses their Cellasto wedge, and there is some adjustment available in that. There's 3 different weights of Cellastos, and we've been out riding. We put a lot of miles now on the all-road with motors and without motors, and it 100% does great on the road. Provides a very good vibration dampened ride.
Dampens the road is the best way to put it. It isn't the trike I would take off-road.
Right.
But it does a really good job. My wrists hurt a lot of the time anyways, and riding those rigid trikes and getting rattled to death, it's just smooth.
Right.
And that's what you want out of a good front suspension, at least when you're on road. Something that just levels the playing field. We took it over some cattle guards.
Yeah.
And I was joking, if this wasn't a suspension trike, that would have rattled me to death.
Yeah. Yeah, it really makes a big difference. The biggest drawback of Catrike's front suspension design that I see is that it is not available as a retrofit. And, and I commented on this in one of our all-road videos that to me, that's a big shame.
Yeah.
Because there's so many people out there that already have Catrikes, and if they could add front suspension to it, they would.
Well, there's, the all-road and the Dumont, I think, fit a pretty wide range of riders and specific needs. It doesn't fit all of them. If we were able to include the rest of the Catrike lineup, being able to throw suspension on all of them would be a huge benefit, across the board.
Well, and, case in point, the number one request that we've had since we announced, Catrike's all-road is, can I get that in the Max model? Because the all-road itself is kind of seen as a Catrike Villager with suspension. And now people go, well, I really wanted the Catrike Max.
Let me get the big brother with, suspension. Let's get the same treatment.
Right. But then that comes down to, one of the limitations that you have with elastomer-based suspension is, again, it's that weight rating. Where Catrike does have the different weights of Cellastos, but their max weight, is about a 275-pound rider weight.
You hit that limit. You're going to hit that limit of the Cellasto way before hitting that Trike's frame limit.
Right.
And that's the factor with the Max.
Well, the Max has a weight capacity of 400 pounds.
Yeah.
And a 400-pound rider sits on that.
Yeah, and even if you put their biggest suspension on there for the heaviest rider, you're bottoming out.
Right.
So, and then you're having the same problems we talked about with the CXF. A bottom out suspension is going to ruin your handling. To some degree, you're going to feel that in the way you control the trike.
It's ineffective at best.
Right.
And at worst, it'll flop around because the Cellastos themselves won't last that long if they're just
if they're compressed all the time, they're going to have to be replaced all the time, and it's more maintenance. And that's not to dog on Catrike the whole time. There's a reason we've been riding the all-road so often. I love this trike.
Oh yeah, no, and the all-road's great, and that kind of takes us back to, do you need a trike with suspension? And since we've been, one of my issues has been as a pedal power rider, I like to have a trike that is lightweight and fast and easy to ride and lets me experience the road without the discomfort, you know, and sometimes I don't need a big suspension. You know, for example, we've also been riding the off-road trikes like the Steintrikes. So the Steintrikes are on the other end where they have double A-arm suspension and they have the most travel.
Yeah, it was like the other end's a good way of putting it. They're like streets over, I mean, their suspension's so much more travel and so much more give than any of the other brands out there.
And, you know, one thing that you say a lot when we go and ride these is when you're off-road, they just come alive. Like, and you can see that suspension's moving up and down and it's absorbing the bumps. They have over 4 inches of travel.
In the same vein of they come to life when I'm off-road, I am on-road and I'm looking forward to get off of it. You know,
sure.
I actually do kind of feel that suspension travel a little bit in the way it handles, the way it climbs hills especially.
Right.
You know, there was just this lack of, you know, the suspension's a little too squishy here, you know. Whereas other models that still have suspension, like the all-road, the CXS, your stiffer road suspension models, I didn't feel that way. I was on the road, I loved it, felt great. And we were a little unfair in our Stein video. We didn't adjust the suspension, we didn't tighten it up to be on road and loosen it to go off-road. But there is something to say about that significant of a travel being a drawback for your lightweight and fast trike.
Right, well, and it's, you know, if having one trike that will do everything does require that you adjust it for the terrain when you have the suspension. And you're right, you know, we took out trikes that we had basically tuned for off-road riding. And so they have a little bit softer suspension setup, and we're taking the bumps and they feel absolutely great. But when you get on the road, they felt a little sluggish.
And the big word that, you know, sag, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you feel it, you put pedal down, how much is my frame compressing, my suspension sinking that I'm losing in the power output of my chain. And you don't feel that on certain models that have stiffer, harder road suspension.
Yeah, more limited.
More limited, yeah. I mean, where the frame really can't compress that much.
Right.
There is no power loss. And I think that is kind of, just to circle back on the all-road, because I do love it to death, there is none. There's no power loss in the suspension. I go hit a hill. We took them out with motors. We hit the throttle. I didn't feel the frame do that compress, you know? There's nothing. There's no loss. Whereas if we threw a motor on a Stein and we don't tighten the suspension down to be on street, we're going to hit that throttle and we're going to feel it compress a little bit. That's some power loss. It's just gone. So do you need suspension? Maybe, you know, what kind of terrain are you riding on? Let's start that conversation of, you know, do you need this thing to fit your specific needs on the trails you're going to be riding on? Do you need something that's going to just do everything all right and do a good job at it? You know, they all made so differently that there is a perfect and middle ground to find on all of them.
Well, and I feel, you know, like when we have these conversations and when we go out there and we're riding, we're doing comparisons. My goal as the guy making these videos is to try to be as unbiased as possible to make an accurate comparison. But I'm also aware that, you know, as Utah Trikes, as a company that's selling and marketing trikes for different manufacturers, that we also want to represent all the manufacturers that we carry in the best way. And, you know, we did a video a while back about, you know, why we carry the trikes that we carry and the brands that we carry. And I think this kind of goes into that a little bit, where the suspension trikes that we have, in my opinion, they serve different riders' needs. And a lot of times, like, as you know, when we're talking with manufacturers, they want to push forward the idea that, like, our trike is best for everybody, or our trike will fit everybody. And, you know, a lot of times we're dealing with the customers, and then we're also out there riding, and we may have a different idea of, like, well, if you need a trike for this type of terrain or this kind of riding, this might be the better trike for you, and it may not be one from this brand. It may be from another brand.
Better trike's the best way to put it. It's not a right or wrong most of the time. Because we did the video where we compared the CXS suspension with the Stein, and we took them down the same paths, and they did it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and talk about two different ends. The absolute most basic suspension trike from Sunseeker, and a totally top-end trike that costs 4 times as much from Stein. They both rode the path.
You know, we both got back. We both went out there. We had a good time. There were smiles. There were laughs. But we would be lying if we said one of them didn't handle some of the off-road trails better than the other one did.
We took these trikes on some railroad tracks, and the CXS, while it did the ride, was brutal to ride. Knocked us around, hard to talk, hard to hold on. You know, where having a true off-road trike went just great. So one brand of trike that we really haven't talked a lot about yet is Azub.
Yeah, we've been kind of, you know, and it's funny, just coming off of Stein, you know, and leading into Azub, we have the titanium plates instead of the swing arms that we have on the Stein that take most of your brunt and all of your flex.
In a lot of ways, I would say that Azub probably has the most unique suspension design, though, of any of the manufacturers, where they're relying on the flex and rigidity of their titanium leaf spring to actually provide for the suspension itself. And then they're combining that with 2 dampeners, one on each side, to, you know, prevent the oscillation, kind of control the rebound a little bit. It's a very unique kind of setup there. And in some ways, it seems a little similar to an A-frame kind of design in that you have, you know, the pivot up from each side. But some unique aspects of it are that when one side lifts up, it naturally wants to lift up the other side a little bit.
Right.
But it doesn't have quite as much travel.
Yeah.
You know, and that's a weird thing too, because a lot of people, they see how big that Azub front suspension is, and you just naturally assume that that thing's going to have a lot of travel to it. But I think the Ice Kingpin front suspension has a little bit more travel.
A little more.
Yeah, a little bit more travel than the Azub front suspension.
It was funny, you know, we took both the Stein and the Azub out and compared them. We took them down the same trails, the same paths, taking the Stein, again, we mentioned earlier, feels like it comes to live off-road, whereas the Azub, when we were taking it on specific off-road trails, like the railroad tracks, I was missing that suspension travel. You know, we have 2 high-end suspension trikes that are drastically different in the way that they handle and feel, and how much travel they have, and how they rebound, and how much sag and squish they give you. And in the same way that I felt the Stein came to life on off-road, I felt the Azub kind of came to life and shined the most on the road, or like dirt, gravel roads. And that's the dampening. You know, they use the dampening system to reduce the rattles you're going to get from all of your road debris, gravel, dirt, and not worried about the 4 3-inch drops you're going to see on like a Steintrike.
Right. Yeah, that Azub suspension just on the road is absolutely fantastic. I know that the TieFly X is probably our most popular Azub model that we sell. I kind of like it with the smaller wheels.
Well, so yeah, that's, you know, and I think we're actually seeing a shift in the market a little bit on that. As people are just kind of become more aware and there's more knowledge about them out there. The TieFly X is sweet, 26-inch wheels all the way around. It looks cool, it's big, it's mean.
Sits up high.
It's
up tall,
higher. You have a higher seat, you know, which for a lot of people, that's probably gonna be more important than suspension anyways. The 26-inch wheels really only benefit you in ground clearance, right? You're gonna sit up a little bit higher. Yeah, for off-road use, that's kind of what you want in a lot of cases, right? Going through sagebrush and avoiding things. But that 20-inch in the front, 26 in the rear really benefits from being on-road. You're back to on-road with a street suspension. You kind of need that big boulder pushing your tiny small wheels in the front. Just helps you maintain speed a lot easier than the drag that would be produced on a 26-inch front end. And I actually think the suspension on the Azub suits better for like the Azub TieFly 26 with the 20s and 26 better than it does the Azub TieFly X.
If you're going to get front suspension, matching it with the right wheel size and everything definitely makes a big difference. I mean, we saw, for example, we already mentioned Ice, the full fat.
Right.
When the full fat first came out, they had the front suspension on there, 26 by 4-inch big fat wheels, and then you also had suspension. They stopped offering that, you know, partly because weight ratings and stuff like that, but they also found that, you know, there were extra vibrations that happened because of that front suspension. And with the bigger tires, you maybe didn't need it as much.
It's funny you say that, because in the same vein when we were talking about the CXS and we had a lot of people switch to rigid, I don't know if they're really noticing the difference in that lack of the CXS suspension, because those fat 20-inch by 4-inch tires are absorbing a lot of it already.
Right. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, what you want is the right trike for the right terrain. And if you're going to get suspension, you want to get the right kind of suspension. And you know, when we started recording this video, you know, the question was, do you need a trike with suspension? Is suspension right for you? And the tricky part about answering this, and it's the same issue that we have.
What's the best trike?
It always comes up, right? What's the best trike? Or do I need a trike with a motor? Or should I get fat wheels? It's so hard when you're only going to have one trike. You know, if and we realize that most of our customers are only going to get one trike.
Yep.
Now, a lot of guys get more. I mean, we have guys that have garages full. You know, the way that I kind of look at it, though, is like, you know, people are out there and they're buying cars and they go, well, should I get a pickup truck? Well, you know, if you need a pickup truck, and if you need a pickup truck, then you've got to have a pickup truck. Does that make it the best car all the time? No, because there's going to be times when having the minivan where you can haul six people around.
Better gas mileage.
Yeah.
You know,
you know,
which one works better for what you're using it for.
Yeah. So if you're trying to find one car for every scenario, it's going to be tricky. If you're going to try to find one trike that does it all the time, that's going to be very tricky. Now, there are some trikes, and I guess this is probably going to be the most useful part of the video here is what are those trikes that we would consider to be more in between?
Kind of your do everything.
Kind of for do everything. And I guess that's where I look at it and I go, you know, at the upper end that we already talked about, if you're mainly doing off-road, but you're also riding on-road, and so having, you know, on-road handling is important, but you're mainly doing some off-road riding, I think it's really hard to beat that Azub Tyfly X.
Azub Tyfly X. I think there's an argument that can sort of be made for the HP Scorpions.
Yeah, the Scorpion and the HP, the Enduro model, you know, which is the Scorpion FS with bigger, fatter tires on it. Also a good option. And those are trikes that I would lean more towards. I'm doing off-road, but also some road. You know, if I'm doing mostly road riding, but I'm doing some off-road trails.
Off-road trails, I have cattle grades I'm worried about.
Yeah.
You know, some gravel.
Yeah, at that point, I would probably, you know, my favorite trike in that scenario would probably be the Ice Sprint X Tour.
Yeah, definitely a favorite.
You know, I think it's, you know, that trike handles very well on, you know, on the road and does some off-road good. If I'm looking for a more off-road only, those are kind of at the high end. I'm probably going to go with the Stein because I want that suspension travel.
If you're really going to do some serious off-road, Stein.
Right. You know, on the low end though, I could maybe give up some of the cost of suspension and go with fat tires.
Right.
And that's that kind of tricky thing where you go on for off-road, full suspension, loving the Steintrike, but I also kind of like the Ice Full Fat, and I also like even the CXS. The CXS for a $2,500 trike, that thing is an absolute blast to ride. And it's inexpensive enough that you could go, hey, I'm going to throw a motor on there, and I'm still cheaper than these other trikes, you know. On the other side though, for road riding, you know, especially if I'm touring, if I'm riding, you know, ice trikes have been a favorite for a long time. The Ice Adventure, the Ice, you know, the Sprint, they're modular with, you know, the current tariff situations and shipping, everything. They are more expensive though, and I think that, you know, that's where Catrike has picked the perfect time.
Catrike's got a sweet spot
to come in with that all-road, and I think that like the new all-road, and then if you want a folding version, the Catrike Dumont are absolutely amazing full suspension road trikes.
And you kind of put it perfectly. For the price that they are, not having to pay that premium for the full suspension like you do on a lot of other models, they sit right there in that sweet, affordable spot in recumbent trikes.
Yeah, I mean, to go from, you know, one of the Catrike full suspension models up to like the Ice full suspension model.
We're 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 sometimes. I mean, it depends on the model, but I mean, that's a big jump.
Yeah.
And for the price of some of those Ice models or Azub, Stein, you can get 2 Catrikes.
Yeah. Well, there you have it, right? So, hopefully, we didn't just confuse everyone.
Overload too much information.
You know, we did. We talked a little bit more about some of the brand specifics than I had originally planned on, but hopefully, as you watch this video, you get a little bit more familiar with the types of suspension that are out there, what they're good for, the kind of riding that you want to do. And while it is hard to find a trike that is going to be the best for every rider and every terrain, that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
There are a lot of options with a lot of crossover.
Right. I was like, not the best at everything, but good at most.
Yeah, good at most. And you know, the trikes that we carry really are good for pretty much everything.
We wouldn't carry the trike if we hated it.
We've taken the absolute, you know, we've taken some of the least expensive trikes and we've taken them on the same rides that we've also ridden the most expensive trikes, and they did it.
Yeah. I mean, that should be the
we made it, and we came back, you know, and we were glad that we got a switch off because some of them were a little more brutal than others.
Alleviate my back a little bit, give it a break.
Yeah. Well, guys, if you have any questions regarding any trikes, suspension, whatever your needs are for the different terrain that you might want to ride, please let us know. Comment below if you have a trike with suspension. Let us know what you like. What kind of trike do you have? What kind of suspension do you like? What kind of terrain are you riding? We want to hear that from you.
And I know this video can kind of be all over the place. We have been doing those comparison videos. They are on the channel.
Yeah.
That we're talking specifically about this model and the suspension on them both and how they're doing on the terrain. So if you just need some direct answers, they're out there. We're making videos. Just check them out. Plenty of information.
All right, guys. Well, as always, we encourage you to relax, spin fast, and ride trikes. We'll see you next time.
Take care, guys.
Oh shit, that's gonna flatten your tire. Holy dude. We gotta get back. Look at that. Lord.